Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a couple of housekeeping items. Please note we are recording this show, and also please make sure you mute yourself if you are not speaking. I'm excited to welcome you to another episode of our show, Planning Today for Tampa's Tomorrow. I'm your host, LaShawn Dock, and it is truly a pleasure to host this series. I'm a part of the City of Tampa City Planning Department, which is where all things planning related in the city are strategically coordinated for success. As a part of our planning efforts, we continuously strive to provide and maintain open communication with you, the citizens of Tampa. Whether it's related to neighborhood plans or various planning related projects, we want to keep you informed. I want to mention that this show is fairly new, as this is our second episode. I want everyone to keep in mind we value your input as we continue to shape and format the content of this show. So we're looking to continually improve with each episode. Now we have a great topic for today. We will discuss the city's vision and updates to the comprehensive plan. Please note that during the show, while the comment function is active and can be utilized to enter your questions or comments, we have set aside time so you will have an opportunity to ask your questions during our Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. Next slide, please. So let's get started with today's program. I'm happy to introduce today's featured guest, Stephen Benson. Stephen is Chief Planner in the City Planning Department. Stephen, before your presentation, can you briefly tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, LaShawn, and welcome everybody. My name is Stephen Benson. I am with the City of Tampa Planning Department, and I'm thrilled to be able to speak with you this evening about the work we're doing to develop a long-range vision for the City of Tampa. I am a certified planner with the American Institute of Certified Planners and have over 10 years of experience in public policy, urban planning and design, walkability, transportation planning, and engineering. I'm also a third-generation Tampa native and a proud graduate of the University of South Florida. So just thank you very much for having me on the show today. Next slide. So today we're going to be talking about the big picture, but first we will be taking a look at some examples in the community of growth and change, and we will talk about what those words mean specifically in terms of the plans, policies, and regulations that we have in place here in Tampa. Then we'll talk more specifically about what a vision is and why it is important that we are updating it, looking out to the year 2045. To do this, we'll take a look at some of the growth trends throughout the city over the last 10 years and the projections and forecasts that we have about future growth coming to the city. Then we'll touch upon some of the recent initiatives and hot topics that we hope to integrate into our vision for the future. And we will share with you some preliminary vision material that we have developed and ask for your feedback. Then we'll go over how this vision will translate into the update of the city's comprehensive plan that will occur over the next few years. Next slide.
So Stephen, can you tell us what is a vision plan?
Sure, next slide. So a vision plan can mean different things to different people and to different communities, but here when we say vision plan, what we're referring to is a single vision that explains a couple of things. It's going to explain where and how the city will grow and change in the future. It will represent the core values that our entire community shares. It will include some guiding principles to drive how we will achieve the vision, as well as clarifying what our goals are and what our desired outcomes are. And then it will also touch upon some strategies and actions, specific actions that we hope to use to implement the vision. Next slide.
Now, what does growth and change look like in Tampa?
Okay, so here's where we get to the fun part. We get to look at examples and then discuss what we're seeing and what they mean. So This is the first example. We're going to show a series of before and after slides and then talk about what we're seeing on the slides. So this is a residential neighborhood in South Tampa. This is the before image. And you can see it's 3 residential homes. And then this is the after image over the course of the several years. You can see that some of the changes that have taken place on the street. Next slide. And here's where we can compare them. So you can see that, maybe the homeowner on the left, I think did some significant tree trimming. But aside from that, there's a significant change on this street. So looking specifically at what that means for growth and change, this is not an image that depicts growth, specifically from the standpoint of housing. So we went from 1 housing unit to 1 housing unit. That center home was taken down and replaced with a significantly larger home, almost double the size of the previous home. Then when we look at our zoning, our local zoning regulations, there was no change in the zoning for this to occur. And then there was no change in the adopted future land use in this area for this change to occur. So this would be an example of no growth and high change. So in this slide, this is the before image of the downtown waterfront area. Next slide. And then this is the after image. We went from 0 housing units to 3,500 housing units. Next slide. And so when we compare the two, you see it was a significant increase in housing, so very high growth. When it comes to the form, the physical form, it was a high change, obviously. Vacant land and underutilized land, surface parking, and then the after condition is the Water Street Phase 1 redevelopment in the downtown area. For this to occur, there was no zoning change, no local zoning change, and then no change to the adopted future land use. Next slide. So here's an example on the Florida Avenue area of Seminole Heights. This is a photo from 2016 of the before condition. Next slide. And then this is the after condition. You can see a very significant change. It is, however, a little bit unclear what exactly is happening in this building. Is it a residential building? Is it an office? Is it a restaurant of some kind? You can see there isn't really an easy way to get to the entrance. Next slide. But when we compare our information, we're going from 0 units to 0 units. So there was no growth in housing, but there is a growth in non-residential use. So this is actually a self-storage facility. So we went from vacant and underutilized land to a self-storage facility. There was a change to the zoning for this to occur, and there was not a change to the adopted future land use. So we would refer to this as high growth and high change. Next slide. Another example on that same corridor, this is an image in 2010. Next slide. And then this is that same corner in 2019, 10 years later. Next slide. So you can see here that we went from 0 housing units to 70 housing units on the same piece of land. We went from an auto-oriented use, a car lot, to a mixed-use building with residential on the upper floors and then retail and commercial on the first floor. There was not a zoning change and there was not a land use change for this to occur. So we'd also call this high growth and high change. Next slide. And these next few are going to be a little bit quicker just to get through some final examples, but this is an example of a street in South Tampa. The top is the before 2010 and the bottom is 2020, just to give a sense of the other end of the spectrum. Obviously, very little change has happened on the street, and so we acknowledge that in many areas of the city, we do not anticipate growth or change. So when we talk about growth and change, it's really generalized across an entire area of the city and doesn't mean that an entire portion of the city will see significant change. So in this example, there's no growth in housing, no change in physical form, and of course, no zoning and no land use change. And then the last example on the next slide, this is an example of low growth and high change. So this went from a single family house, 1 housing unit on a double lot in the West Shore Palms area, went from 1 unit to 4 units. So this isn't necessarily high growth, but this is growth. In terms of the physical form, it was a 500% increase in building size, so significantly larger buildings, significant physical change to this neighborhood. And then there was a zoning change associated with this. It went from RS50 zoning to a planned development zoning, and there was no future land use change for this to occur. The next slide. So what's important to note is that while some of these projects required a rezoning, none of them required a future land use change. And that is really what underscores the importance of planning for the future, so that we can ensure that our regulations and our plans are updated continuously to reflect the needs for growth and change.
Now, Stephen, looking ahead, what is the projected growth for Tampa, and can you tell us what areas have seen the most growth?
Sure. So as you can see on the screen there, we have 3 different numbers. The first is housing, the second is actual population, number of people, and the third is jobs. So since 2010, we've seen about 18,000 additional housing units or homes in Tampa be created. We've seen an additional 55,000 residents and an additional 67,000 jobs. Next slide. So in comparing those 3, we want to make note that the 2020 population, the growth that we've seen, is in line with what we had planned. It's in line with what prior forecasts have shown in terms of a citywide number. The population growth, however, has slightly outpaced the growth in housing that's occurred. So 16% growth in population, but only 13% growth in housing. And then from a job growth standpoint, we see that the number of jobs has significantly outpaced the number of housing. So that gap really is filled by commuters that are coming into the city to fill these additional jobs that have been created here. Next slide. So where in the city has this growth occurred? So a very large portion of the growth, 84%, that has occurred since 2010 in terms of new housing, has occurred in 3 areas of the city. It's occurred in the New Tampa area, it's occurred in the Central Tampa area, and it's occurred in the South Tampa area. And we do want to make note and point out that the current plan emphasizes that there are limited additional opportunities for more growth in both South Tampa and New Tampa. Next slide. So looking at the other 2 areas of the city, limited housing growth has occurred in the University area and the West Shore area, but both of these areas were actually planned to accommodate much more growth than what has occurred. So looking forward, we are going to be looking at ways to shift some of that growth from the other 2 areas into the West Shore and the University areas. Next slide. Now looking at job growth, it's a little bit different of a picture. So since 2010, almost the same proportion as before, about 83% of the job growth has occurred in the University area, in the Central Tampa area, and in the West Shore area. And of course, these are the 3 areas that contain our 3 major job centers, including downtown and West Shore. And this is generally in line with what our current plan has set forth. Next slide. So looking specifically at which areas are growing the fastest. New Tampa is the fastest growing area of the city for several reasons, just because the nature of that growth is very different. It's new development and not redevelopment, but that rate of growth is slowing down. So you can see that easily if you compare the white bar, which is the 2010 amount of population within each of these areas, to the blue bar. The blue bar represents the 5-year growth that occurred between 2010 and 2015, and the red bar represents the 5-year growth that occurred between 2015 and 2020. So if the blue bar is smaller than the red bar, then the growth is increasing. If the red bar is smaller than the blue bar, then the housing growth, the rate of growth is actually going down. So you'll see that even though New Tampa was the fastest growing, that rate of growth is decreasing because that area of the city is being built out with new subdivisions. And so we do anticipate, as these last developments go online, that growth will slow down significantly. South Tampa, however, is the second fastest growing, and it's the opposite of New Tampa. That rate is increasing, and we can see that because the red bar is larger than the blue bar. So the growth that's occurred in South Tampa over the last 5 years is greater than what occurred in the 5 years prior. Now looking at the University area and the West Shore area, as I said before, the growth in those areas is much slower than what was planned, but still significant, especially in the West Shore area where the amount of housing has significantly increased based upon what was there before. And then overall, we do want to acknowledge that the largest share of the growth, the greatest chunk of growth in housing has occurred in the central Tampa area, which is where it was intended based upon the current comprehensive plan. Next slide. We know that housing is a critical issue, especially as of late. And so taking a quick look and a deeper dive into the housing situation, this chart represents the amount of households at each income level, and then the amount of homes that actually exist in the county that are affordable to people at that income level. So the yellow bar is the number of homes, and the red bar is the number of households. So you can see that at the highest income level, the household income of $75,000 or more, in Hillsborough County, we have about an 80,000 shortage in number of housing units. So that shortage means that these people are not actually homeless, of course. They're residing in homes that, for lack of a better term, are below their means. So they're residing in homes that would be affordable to households at lower income levels. So what this does is it creates pressure and pushes that housing demand down. And ultimately, the lowest income households are pushed into the rental market due to the lack of homes to purchase at their income level. Next slide, we'll actually look at the same chart, but it's for renter occupied housing. So looking at this, it's a similar story, but a little bit different. The number of households at the highest income level that are renting are double the actual number of homes that we have in the county. So again, that's a shortage. It's a 26,000 unit gap, and that creates pressure pushing downward. And of course, what does this mean? It means that the greatest burden is put on those households that are earning less than $20,000 per year because there is nowhere else for them to live. And so this, in a nutshell, should give you a snapshot of what the current housing situation is in Hillsborough County and in Tampa. Next slide.
So Stephen, when we talk about growth, what policy tools are used to help measure and guide growth within the city?
Next slide. Great. So the way that we manage growth is a couple of different ways. So there are laws, mainly Florida statutes, which is what creates our ability to regulate land in Florida. We also have adopted plans and then adopted local regulations, specifically our land development code, which is used as the tool to implement the comprehensive plan in terms of land development. Next slide. And then now specifically what is in those documents and in those plans in terms of how we regulate growth. So there are a variety of factors that are used. When we talk about how we regulate housing, we generally refer to that as density or number of housing units per acre of land. When we talk about non-residential development, so commercial or retail or office, we refer to the maximum development potential or floor area ratio, FAR. And then what FAR essentially means is how large the building can be in relation to the land that it sits on. So the little image on the right shows you 3 different iterations of a 1-to-1 floor area ratio. It doesn't mean that's the only regulation in place. It just means that's a regulation to control the size of the building in relation to the amount of land that it occupies. We also have other kinds of development incentives, other requirements in our zoning code and overlay districts that regulate things like height and setbacks. It's far too many to mention here, but it's a multitude of different site-specific requirements. And it's also important to note that growth, housing growth and job growth, that is usually associated with a change in physical form, with a new building or a different building, but it isn't always, especially in Tampa where we have a lot of activity with adaptive reuses of existing historic structures, like what you're seeing in the central Tampa area. Next slide. So how is change controlled and guided? Change is controlled and guided in a similar way, but a little bit differently. So change is guided through policies in the comprehensive plan. It's also guided through policies in our land development code and regulations in our land development code. We control and we regulate the physical form of buildings through form-based criteria and also through our overlay districts and local historic districts. And then we also guide change through our neighborhood and community planning work that we do. Next slide. So looking forward, how much growth do we expect in the future? Looking out to 2045, so 25-year planning horizon is what we call it. The estimated growth by 2045 in number of homes and number of housing units is about 50%. And that means about 77,000 more homes created within the city of Tampa. When it comes to actual people and residents, we expect a 28% increase. This is 108,000 new residents by 2045. And then when it comes to jobs, we expect over 250,000 new jobs being created in the city of Tampa by 2045. Next slide. So looking at the comprehensive plan update, one of the main goals of the comprehensive plan is to be able to plan for that growth and make sure that we are able to accommodate it in a way that everybody in the community can support and get behind. The state of Florida recommends updating the comprehensive plan for your community every 7 years. The last update that we did was in 2015. It is a multi-year process that is done in partnership with the Hillsborough County Planning Commission, and it involves a significant amount of community and stakeholder involvement. As part of this process, our team will evaluate and assess all the existing goals, objectives, and policies in the comprehensive plan. And as we update it, the update to the plan will drive modernization of other regulations and other tools that we use to implement the plan, like the Land Development Code and like future neighborhood and corridor plans. Next slide.
Now, Stephen, you mentioned community and stakeholder involvement, which is very important in planning. So in what ways are we gathering input from the community?
So there are a multitude of different places that we're pulling from to get this guidance and to get this input. There have been several different strategic initiatives over recent years as part of the updates to transportation master plans, as part of the Mayor's Transforming Tampa's Tomorrow initiative, as part of the Tampa Moves initiative, as well as some other strategic initiatives like our Resilient Tampa Roadmap, as well as the show that we're currently on right now. And what we're going to be doing is taking the input that we receive from all of these sources and integrating it into information that we have today is based upon the information pulled from all of these different activities. Next slide. So here we are going to be presenting to you for public review the 2045 citywide vision or proposed vision statement. And that statement is, this plan envisions a Tampa that leverages growth and change to create strong and connected neighborhoods, resilient and sustainable environment, and inclusive opportunities for all people to lead healthy and prosperous lives. So this is our proposed vision statement. And at the end of the show, we will be asking for your comments and your feedback on this information. So please take notes or feel free to save your comments and submit them to us. Looking at the 2045 vision and the guiding principles, these are the core principles that we believe represent our community's values and how we will plan for the future. The first is that we want to be an integrated and connected city. The second is that we want our city to be strong and we want our city to be complete. We want our city to be equitable and inclusive. And then we want Tampa to be healthy, sustainable, and resilient. So those are the four guiding principles that we would offer to be used as the guiding principles for the comprehensive plan update. Next slide. Looking at this more specifics, the goals, actions, and outcomes. These boxes on the screen represent the goals, actions, and outcomes that we envision and that we'd like to see in 2045. Some of these directly relate to strategic issues or the most pressing hot topics that we're seeing in our community. You see housing choice, you see safe and accessible mobility options, an integrated and a complete mix of uses in all neighborhoods, sustainable and equitable infrastructure. So all of these are goals and outcomes that we want to see come out of this plan as measures of success. If these things can be achieved, then we know our plan has been successful. Next slide. So looking a little bit more closely at where do we expect some of the growth to go, the image on the right is the 2045 growth vision map. This map was produced by the Hillsborough County Planning Commission based upon the 2045 population, employment, and housing projections that I showed on the prior slides. And then we can see here that the central Tampa, the West Shore Tampa, and the University area of Tampa are projected to see higher levels of growth. And the New Tampa area and the South Tampa area, we project to still see growth, but at a much lower rate than the other three areas. And now this is just growth, but on the next slide, we'll look at how change looks on top of this. So this is how we envision seeing change continue to occur. Change in physical form, but not necessarily growth. So what drives change? What drives change is permitting activity and real estate market trends. We also know that policy drives change. So our community redevelopment areas are areas that we hope and we expect to see change occur within. Our mixed use and our transit corridors, areas with higher future land use, more intense and dense future land uses, and then areas that have neighborhood and corridor plans that specifically call for changes that those areas would like to see in their area. And so we see here that in the central Tampa area, we anticipate continued high growth and high change. In the West Shore area, generally we anticipate also high growth and high change. In the University area, we anticipate high growth and then less change than in the central Tampa and West Shore areas. So we're calling that a medium amount of change. In the New Tampa area, we expect to see low growth and low change. And then in the South Tampa area, we expect to see low growth and then again, a medium amount of change, again, primarily driven by the amount of permitting and development activity occurring in that area. Next slide. So now looking at what tools we could maybe use to help better guide growth and change in the future. This is an example of a transect. The urban to rural transect is a tool. It's a visual tool, a graphic tool that's used by urban planners to organize and to communicate about different types of neighborhoods and places within an overall city. And this is an example city. Next slide. So we see this is a little bit similar to maybe a land use map or a zoning map. However, it is visual. It's three-dimensional and it's meant to paint a picture that is a little bit more clear in terms of how a community looks and how we envision it looking in the future. So the transect helps to visually and geographically organize the unique form of every neighborhood in relation to one another and how it forms a complete city unit overall. Next slide. So looking specifically maybe at how a transect could be applied or could be reflected in our existing neighborhoods in Tampa. This is an example of where a neighborhood such as Port Tampa City might fall. We can see that we have a small neighborhood commercial area as well as traditional residential neighborhoods surrounding it. Next slide. Then we can also identify some similarities with the New Tampa area and the suburban residential development that we see in that area, as well as the suburban office park development. And then on the right side, more closer into the city, we see examples of the suburban commercial development pattern, both there with West Shore Mall and then the IKEA in the central Tampa area. Next slide. And now looking at some of the examples as we get closer into the urban core, we see that the urban neighborhoods that are closer to the downtown area, like East Tampa and West Tampa, these are traditional residential and mixed-use neighborhoods, and they're represented in the transect. And then getting even closer into the urban core, areas such as Ybor City and the Channel District, denser mixed-use neighborhoods can also be represented. Next slide. And then here on the screen, we see that each community is able to take the transect and really tailor it to their own needs and their own vision for the future. So many cities have found value in developing a transect to set the vision for the city and help guide growth and change in the future. A Tampa specific transect is going to have to be tailored to our unique development patterns, our physical form, our densities, intensities, the character of all of our neighborhoods, and our vision for the future. Next slide.
So what specific actions will be part of implementing the vision?
Great. So as I mentioned in the prior slides, we have a multitude of different initiatives that are feeding into this process, recommendations and ideas that will affect citywide planning. For example, the Neighborhood Commercial District program has recommended ways to promote redevelopment of the neighborhood scale commercial districts that we see across the city. We've also recommended developing some design standards to promote compatibility in how those commercial areas transition to the adjacent single-family neighborhoods. Another example is the Sea Level Rise and Coastal Area Action Plan. Work that is ongoing will help equip us with some better tools to manage residential growth within the coastal high hazard area specifically. The Planning Commission is also working with us on research to generate more mixed-use development, especially along our corridors, and then looking at how we can balance that need for minimum mixed-use requirements and the flexibility that is needed to allow for development to be adaptable and to evolve as the real estate market changes in the future. So these are all examples of strategies that will be going into our vision and that we'll be considering as we update the comp plan. Next slide. And then just a few more examples. We've heard a lot of neighborhood concerns about infill development internal to residential neighborhoods, specifically in terms of design and compatibility with the surrounding areas. So we hope to evaluate additional potential tools that will help to protect and support the individual visions for each neighborhood. We think that transect-based planning and form-based criteria are good strategies to do that, and so that's what we will be investigating. We hope to investigate as part of this process. The transit-oriented development study has also recommended some strategies to help make transit-oriented development and transit-supported development, walkable development, to make that the norm rather than the exception, as well as a streamlined process for how to get this type of development, more of it along transit corridors, the type of development that we want to see. And then finally, we also hope to integrate some of these core values that have been emerging as of late, such as equity, sustainability, and resilience, both through promoting small-scale redevelopment as a tool to combat urban poverty and to help build wealth, through reducing dependence on cars and promoting walkability and design, and also for allowing more mixing of compatible uses in as many places as we can. Next slide.
And what are the next steps with the citywide vision?
So the next step is to gather input. So we have offered up some information for everybody, and we'll be posting this video as well as the PowerPoint online for future comment through the end of the year. And so we'll be continuing to gather that input, and then we will finalize the citywide vision for 2045, the vision statement, those vision maps, the goals and the outcomes, as well as the guiding principles. And we will continue to integrate the recommendations from these other ongoing planning activities that have great recommendations that need to get baked into the comprehensive plan. And then early next year, we'll be developing a timeline and a work plan for how we plan to work in partnership with the Planning Commission to update our comprehensive plan.
So I would like to send a special thank you to our guest speaker, Stephen Benson. Stephen, we really appreciate you. A great presentation, lots of good information. But most of all, I'd like to say thank you to everyone tuning in. We would not have a show without you. So this concludes today's show. I hope you can join us for our next show on November 16th. Until then, everyone stay safe and have a good night.